The popular American diplomat Henry Kissinger is no more. The 100-year-old former Secretary of State died on Wednesday at his home in Connecticut. He is credited with shaping the U.S. foreign policy and is fondly remembered for his intellectual brilliance, analytical skill, and mastery over practical statecraft. For more on this conversation, we're now joined by political analyst Musa Mdunge. Musa, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this evening. What was your immediate reaction to the passing of Kissinger?
Good evening, Katleho, and to your viewers. My initial, reaction to the passing of Henry Kissinger is, the man was, of course, 100 years old, and it was expected that at some point, he would pass. And already we could see, even with the celebrations of his 100th birthday, that there was great thought towards the legacy of the man who has very much defined U.S. foreign policy, very much defined the type of character U.S. power takes as in global politics, and very much so the man was a leader and a pioneer of real politics in a manner that few men in his generation could be. He's part of a generation that served in World War II, and he's testament of the importance of migration and immigration to the United States story as an immigrant himself, and the man has really been a leader and a pioneer. And yes, his legacy is one that is quite contested and, one that indeed will be debated for quite some time, particularly when one gives thought and ponders on next year's elections and the direction that the United States may well take.
I mean, you've already given us some highlights, but maybe for viewers that are unaware of Kissinger's impact and involvement in the 1970s in the middle of the Cold War when he served under President Nixon, how would you summarize his entire life?
Well, look, the period in which he served in the United States government was a very significant and consequential period in the United States, given that the world was going through a Cold War. Henry Kissinger served firstly as a national security advisor to President LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, in his administration, advising him in the war in Vietnam. And then he went on to switch his support to Richard Nixon, whom he wasn't really a great supporter of and wasn't very much fond of. But given that he was a very crafty statesman, he played both sides of the political aisle, and he served both as the national security advisor of President Nixon as well as his United States Secretary of State, and the only United States Secretary of State to serve in both those capacities. That shows you the kind of man he was and the kind of influence he had in Washington, D.C. And many, in terms of foreign policy, believe that if we were to characterize the Nixon presidency, we must characterize it as a co-presidency, given how large, Henry Kissinger loomed in that space. And his work extended to the détente towards China, which was very critical in moving China away from the Soviet Union towards the orbit of influence of Washington, D.C. And he was very critical towards the opening up of China in terms of its economy. And that was critical as well in breaking down the Cold War and bringing the end of the Soviet Union. In many ways, Ronald Reagan stands on the back of Henry Kissinger. And that may well be the good side of his legacy. On the negative end of that legacy is the role he played in the Vietnam War. We know of the secret bombings that he sanctioned personally in both Vietnam and in Cambodia, which were estimated to have killed 150,000 civilians. And he was at the head of orchestrating those events. And, analysts who have analyzed the Vietnam War, particularly the surge under Richard Nixon, blame Henry Kissinger for an estimated 3 million to 5 million deaths during that period. And so this man was a very consequential man, and because his legacy is contested, it is why it will be a legacy that will be debated in many, many classes in political science and international relations across the world.
I can believe so. I mean, many have branded him a war criminal, especially for his support for anti-communist dictatorship. And like you say, it brings a very colorful and somewhat maybe balanced way of looking at his political career.
Indeed, it does. Of course, depending on which media outlet you look at, especially in the United States, his legacy will be presented in a different way. If you look at left-leaning media houses, they will raise the issue of his role and legacy and contribution in Vietnam, many calling him a war criminal. But when you look at the Republican Party, and the media houses that support the right-wing ideology in the Republican Party, they will hail him as a man who was critical in bringing the end of the Cold War and really establishing the character of the United States as a superpower in global affairs. So from that perspective, his legacy is quite contested. But of course, it's not just what he did during his period in government, serving under both Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, but also his role post that period. He was a critical advisor from Ronald Reagan up until even President Joe Biden. And we see the response from the White House has been quite muted, given what is happening currently in the world. When you think of the Israel-Hamas conflict right now and the pressure Joe Biden faces from his Democratic Party to be more critical of Israel's approach, where its bombings we know have killed both civilians as well as Hamas. And it is a reminder, of the times of the Vietnam War. It is a reminder of the times of the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, which was an illegal war. And it then sheds light again to the fact that perhaps American exceptionalism is something that we need to go back and revisit and critique, given the failures of American foreign policy, as we witnessed last year with the pulling out of America in Afghanistan and the resurgence of the Taliban regime in that country, an indictment to the failure of American foreign policy.
And is it ironic that upon his death, I mean, a number of statesmen came out with condolences, the Israeli PM Netanyahu saying that meetings with Kissinger were a masterclass in statesmanship, and President Putin praising him as a wise and far-sighted statesman?
Indeed, in conversations that I've had with my students today, we've been really discussing, Henry Kissinger and, U.S. foreign policy and the events that are currently unfolding in the world right now. And of course, as you have rightly so observed, when you look at global response from leaders, if you look particularly from the global south or from the east, there is a positive, response and reaction to the death of Henry Kissinger and his legacy, because these are leaders who are, of course, challenging how America asserts itself. But I think not only it's that, but also it is perhaps a longing to return to a time where they can do business with America, because there was a period in which America sought a détente both to Russia. If you think about the fact that under Bill Clinton, Russia was invited into the G8. When you think about China being invited into the World Trade Organization in 2001, these were attempts to bring these countries, which the global north could no longer ignore in global affairs, around the table. Right now, the period that we are in, we see that there is a failure for leaders to find themselves. And what Henry Kissinger was very much good at doing is to be able to find leaders on common ground. And from that perspective, to negotiate and to build rapport and understand one another. And that's going to be very key if we are going to find solutions both to the conflict in Palestine right now, but also the conflict that is happening in Ukraine today, and the conflicts that continue to happen around the world. So this is a time for the world to reflect, to think, and to go back to the drawing board and think about the kind of world we want to see.
Most certainly, Musa Mdunge. Always a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much for your inputs. That was political analyst Musa Mdunge speaking to us there on the passing of Henry Kissinger.